The most dramatic predator comeback story of the last 50 years didn't happen in a nature reserve or anywhere people were kept out. It happened in the one place biologists assumed wildlife could never thrive, directly on top of us. You're standing on the observation deck of a skyscraper 40 stories up, and 2 feet from your hand, completely unbothered by the noise and the traffic below, is a peregrine falcon, one of the fastest animals on Earth. In 1975, this exact species was nearly gone. Only 324 nesting pairs left in all of North America. Releasing them back onto their natural cliffs didn't save them. The chicks kept getting killed with no real protection nearby. What did save them was rooftops. By 2003, researchers found 40% of Midwest breeding pairs nesting on buildings, more than the 32% still on the cliffs they evolved for. This species didn't just survive next to humans. It looked at the wild version of its own home and chose ours instead. And it's not alone. 3 different species, 3 different continents, the same conclusion. Some animals aren't just adapting to us, they're picking us on purpose. Not out of trust, not because anyone tamed them. There's a calculation happening, and by the end of this video, you'll know exactly what it is. For decades, the working theory about urban wildlife was almost insulting to the animals themselves. Foxes in cities, falcons on buildings, deer wandering into backyards. None of it was framed as a choice. It was forced. Habitat lost, nowhere else to go, making do with whatever scraps of space were left over. That theory explains tolerance. It doesn't explain why some of these animals do better near humans than they ever did in the wild, breeding more successfully, growing measurably tamer, deliberately moving toward the one place their instinct should be telling them to avoid. It's the same blind spot researchers already found in how animals decide who to fear. There's no simple switch flipping safe or unsafe. There's a running calculation, and for a growing number of species, that calculation is increasingly landing on yes. 3 species, 3 continents, 3 completely different reasons for arriving at that same yes. None of it is trust, none of it is taming. Let's start with the one that's already shattered every speed record in the animal kingdom, 40 stories above a city street. To understand why that falcon doesn't see the city as a compromise, you have to go back further than its own lifetime. Picture a falcon settling onto her eggs on a cliff ledge in the 1960s, doing exactly what her species had done for 1 million years, and the shell cracking under nothing more than the weight of her own body. That image, repeated across thousands of nests, is the real reason peregrines nearly disappeared. Not habitat loss, not hunting. A pesticide called DDT built up in their bodies, thinning their eggshells until the birds were destroying their own future just by sitting still. By the time DDT was banned and the chemical finally washed out of the food chain, the handful of surviving falcons needed somewhere, anywhere, to start over. And what happened next stopped being a simple recovery story almost immediately. Conservationists tried the obvious thing first, release young falcons onto the wild cliffs their species had always used. It failed. With no parents experienced enough to defend them, the chicks were picked off one after another. So researchers tried something that, on paper, sounds like giving up on the species' instincts entirely. They moved the nest boxes onto rooftops. The falcons didn't seem to notice the difference. And here's the part that should stop you. A skyscraper ledge isn't a consolation prize for a peregrine falcon. By the numbers, it's frequently the better cliff. No ground predator can climb 40 stories. No rival falcon has already claimed the view. And waiting below in nearly every city on the planet is a near-bottomless buffet of the bird's favorite food. Pigeons by the thousands that evolved with essentially zero defense against something that hits 200 miles an hour in a dive. Researchers studying exactly where these birds settle within a city found they're not choosing buildings at random either. They favor ledges near water, parks, open green space, the same kind of varied terrain a cliff over a river valley would have given their ancestors. The payoff shows up in the number that actually matters to a wild bird. Urban peregrines raise more chicks to adulthood than their rural relatives do, almost entirely because the hunting is so much easier. The same breeding pair will return to the same rooftop, sometimes the same exact ledge, for years, one generation handing the spot to the next, watched now by something no wild falcon has ever had before, a live camera and a few thousand strangers who check in on the nest every morning like it's a soap opera. None of it required the falcon to learn anything about us or about architecture. It only had to apply the one rule it has always used to choose a home: height, visibility, no competition, easy hunting. And a 30-story office tower happened to outscore the cliff its species had trusted for 1 million years. The second species runs a completely different version of the same trade, and you can watch it happen on almost any street in London. Walk down a quiet one at 2 in the morning and you might catch it. A fox, trotting along the pavement like it pays rent there, stopping to nose open a bin bag with the casual confidence of something that has done this 10,000 times before. Red foxes have been slipping into British cities for the better part of a century, and by the time researchers in Glasgow lined up hundreds of urban and rural fox skulls side by side in 2020, the two groups had stopped looking like the same animal. The city foxes had shorter, wider muzzles, smaller brains relative to body size, less difference between male and female skull shape than you'd expect to see in any wild carnivore. Every one of those changes already has a name because biologists have seen this exact combination before. It's called domestication syndrome, and until this study, it had only ever been documented in animals that humans were deliberately breeding to be tame. The most famous version of that experiment ran in Soviet Russia in the 1950s. Researchers on a fur farm bred only the calmest, least fearful foxes, generation after generation. Within about 6 generations, those foxes had floppy ears, shorter snouts, and smaller skulls. The same physical signature is now showing up in London's wild foxes, except nobody bred them for it. They did it to themselves. The likely reason is almost embarrassingly simple. A muzzle built for tearing into a torn-open bin bag or crunching a discarded takeaway box doesn't need the bite force or precision of one built for snapping up a live rabbit in the dark. So the cheapest skull to grow energetically stopped being the wild one. There's a second filter running quietly underneath the first. Not every fox is bold enough to walk down a lit street at midnight with cars passing 2 feet away. The ones that are, eat. The ones that aren't, don't. Over enough generations, the city isn't just reshaping the foxes that live in it, it's deciding, fox by fox, which ones get to. A wolf did this to itself over roughly 10,000 years, and what came out the other end, we now keep on our sofas. These foxes are a few decades into the same experiment, running it entirely on their own. The third species runs a calculation that changes by the hour. Picture an elk at dusk in the forests of northeastern Washington, lifting her head, scenting the wind. And then, instead of melting deeper into the trees the way elk have for as long as wolves have existed, turning and walking straight toward the lit windows of a house. Researchers wanted to know exactly when and why elk make that choice, so between 2017 and 2021, they fitted GPS collars on 63 elk, 42 cougars, and 16 wolves in the same patch of northeastern Washington, then simply tracked where everyone went hour by hour for years. During the day, the pattern looked exactly like every other elk population on record. Stay away from people. But after dark, especially through the summer, that pattern reversed completely. The elk moved toward the areas with the heaviest human footprint, not away from them. The timing gives the calculation away. Summer is calving season, when an elk is carrying or guarding the single most vulnerable thing she will produce all year. And wolves don't hunt evenly across the clock. They hunt hardest exactly when darkness gives them the advantage, which is also exactly when humans are least visible and least active. So the trade an elk appears to be making is this. Humans are a real danger, but a comparatively predictable, mostly daylight one. Wolves are a danger that spikes specifically at night, in summer, next to a calf. Given those two threats on those particular nights, the elk are choosing to stand closer to us. It doesn't always pay off. The same human-heavy zones that make wolves keep their distance also come with roads, headlights, and hunting seasons, and the researchers studying this exact trade-off have a name for when the bet goes wrong. An ecological trap, where the very thing that looks like safety quietly becomes a different kind of risk. But that's exactly what makes this convincing instead of incidental. A fixed instinct doesn't make a mistake like that. Only a running, updating estimate, recalculated by the hour, by the season, by how exposed this particular calf is tonight, can be wrong in that specific a way. Lay these 3 cases side by side, and the differences are almost distracting. A bird matching its nest site to an ancient blueprint. A mammal reshaping its own skull 1 generation at a time without anyone breeding it on purpose. A herd recalculating its risk every single night, by season, by how vulnerable this year's calves happen to be. 3 completely different mechanisms, 3 completely different timescales, a choice made in seconds, a body reshaped over decades, a habitat occupied within one bird's lifetime, and underneath all of them, the exact same engine. This channel has already shown you that fear in a wild animal isn't a switch, it's a constantly updating answer to one question. Does being near this particular human in this particular place right now cost more than it's worth? What these three species prove is that the other side of that same ledger exists too. The calculation doesn't only run toward danger, sometimes it runs all the way through and comes out the other side pointing straight at us. So the next time you see a wild animal that isn't running on a ledge 40 stories up, in an alley at 2 in the morning, at the edge of your headlights on a summer night, don't read it as trust, read it as a number. For that animal, in that moment, you came out ahead. Go back to that skyscraper ledge where this video started. The Peregrine Falcon sitting 2 feet from your hand was never doing anything as simple as tolerating the noise below, or growing used to you, or learning to trust the city. It looked at the only home its species has ever known, a wind-scoured cliff face built for one purpose, height and view and distance from anything that walks, and it looked at the building underneath it and ran the numbers. Somewhere in London tonight, a fox is running the same calculation through its own changing body. Somewhere in Washington, an elk is running it through the dark, by the hour, by how close her calf is standing. And 40 stories beneath this falcon's claws, an entire city keeps moving, never once aware that something has been quietly grating it against a cliff for 50 years, and the city won.